for Institutional Courage. And she's the president as well. And I will put that website for that up on the chat so you can take a look at that when you get some time later. There's a lot of really great information on that website. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. And Wendy, do I have screen share capacity? I'll give it a try.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah, I do. Good. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides. My plan is to give you about 30 minutes of information and then be available for questions. So, and I believe Wendy and maybe Cindy will be looking at the chat questions and then reading some of them to me at the end of my presentation. I really appreciate on Saturday morning having your attention on things I really feel very passionate about. I'm going to take a moment though to acknowledge sort of where we are in this country right at this moment. It's a very painful moment, and it's painful because betrayal that's actually long been denied and present is coming out in the open, and people are seeing betrayal that they didn't necessarily see before. I believe very much that we can, when we better understand the systems that perpetuate abuse of vulnerable people, we're going to be in a much better and stronger position to combat those systems. Paraphrasing Desmond Tutu, across all types of oppression, including racism and sexual violence and their intersections, it's time to go upstream and find out why people are falling in. My work as a researcher is fueled by this desire to understand systems of oppression, especially systems creating and contributing to sexual violence, so we can dismantle those oppressive systems. I'm going to briefly give you some background on research that I've conducted largely at the University of Oregon on betrayal blindness, institutional betrayal, and DARVO, which leads into my current focus on institutional courage. And after telling you about some of these theories and research, tell you about the new nonprofit that I founded. So going way back in time to the early 1990s, I began to study something I call betrayal blindness. And I started with a research question, which was how and why would individuals remain unaware of or forget traumas they'd experienced? Why would people forget having been abused? Why would they apparently not see they're being mistreated in the moment? And also, why are some traumas forgotten? And my proposed answer was betrayal trauma theory. And I'll tell you a little about that. So it really hinges on two observations about very fundamental aspects of human beings. One is that we are exquisitely sensitive to betrayal much of the time. And this makes sense because we're a very social species. We're constantly engaging in contracts with one another, whether explicit, like a marriage contract or work contract, or implicit, which is even more common, such as when you expect your friends to have your back and keep your secrets. That ability to evaluate whether somebody is trustworthy is really important to our survival, because people that cheat or betray us harm us. And so if we don't notice it and don't take action, we're just going to keep getting hurt. So our action is quite adaptive when we're empowered and we detect we're being cheated or betrayed, which is we confront or withdraw. So we say, I'm not going to be your partner or friend anymore or buy things at your store. Or we say, you've got to make it right. You have got to fix this if you want me to continue with you. At the same time, we're also very, very dependent on others for our very survival. And this dependence is in an extreme in infancy. So a baby is utterly dependent on a caregiver. A baby can't live for more than a few minutes in the woods, say, without being cared for. And this caregiving is extremely resource intensive. So the caregivers of infants and even young children are putting enormous resources into that baby or child. What motivates the caregiver to do this? It's not just some sort of nobleness. In fact, caregivers need to be motivated, and they're motivated through the attachment system, which has a built-in and hardwired reward to certain behaviors. So babies that make eye contact and smile and make cooing noises are extremely rewarding to caregivers because of how we're built. And what this creates a kind of reciprocal relationship where the dependent creature is reinforcing the provider. And the way we experience this as people is the emotion of love. And the best way to be lovable is to love, because you engage in just those behaviors that will make you lovable. You approach and you give positive engagement. And with varying degrees, we remain dependent throughout the life course. Even if people like to believe they're independent, we're always dependent on the infrastructure. All that you have to do is live through one of those ice storms in Eugene and not have electricity for a couple of days, and you realize how dependent you are. What happens when you put these two things together? You put betrayal detection and dependence together. What if the person who is betraying you is the person you're dependent on? Here we have now this terrible kind of conflict, because betrayal detection would have you withdraw and confront, but that may not be safe. If you withdraw or confront from somebody you're dependent on, your situation might get a whole lot worse. You might lose your basic caregiving. So now the survival problem is you need to not see the betrayal in order to protect the relationship when you're that dependent. And this is where betrayal blindness comes in. It's a way to spontaneously suppress awareness to protect relationships. And you can think about times in your life you've probably engaged in some amount of this. Maybe it's you really needed that job and you sort of turned a blind eye to some mistreatment so that you didn't have to confront and didn't have to risk losing this thing you really need. For some of us, we've been in relationships with these qualities. This kind of betrayal blindness has a short-run survival advantage, but it comes at a long-run cost for the victim. It's not just for children. As I mentioned, employees mistreated by bosses could have the same dilemma. They could lose their status or even their job by engaging in behaviors that confront or withdraw. So we think that betrayal blindness occurs when awareness would threaten necessary or apparently necessary relationships. And in fact, we've done a lot of empirical research on this, and it indicates betrayal blindness is pervasive. Not just victims, but perpetrators and witnesses also engage in betrayal blindness in order to preserve relationships upon which they depend. In fact, over 20 years, we've been researching this, and we found that betrayal is generally very toxic. So high betrayal is associated with increases in forgetting, depression, anxiety, shame, PTSD, physical illness, hallucinations, self-harm, problematic substance use, and even re-victimization. And furthermore, women and girls are at higher risk of high betrayal than men and boys. I want to switch now to chapter 2, which is newer research on institutional betrayal. So when I was talking, I was mostly talking about interpersonal kinds of betrayal. But institutional betrayal shifts the focus onto the behavior of institutions towards individuals. And the first question we had in my lab was, can institutions betray? And if they do, can betrayal, trauma, and blindness occur in response to institutional betrayal? It made sense to us that we would see institutional betrayal because institutions are the building blocks of a civilized society. They're crucial to our well-being when we totally depend on our government, police, and hospitals to protect our lives. Furthermore, we respond to institutions as if they are, in some sense, love people or things we love. They give our lives meaning, and sometimes institutions really do help us. However, sometimes institutions make our lives worse, not better. Sometimes they don't protect us from harm, or they're indifferent when we suffer. And they may focus first on profits and self-protection, most vulnerable people are the hardest hit. And then we're in this terrible bind when that happens, because we depend on institutions that betray us, just as we may depend on a person that betrays us. The way we define institutional betrayal is very broad. It's institutions harming those dependent on the institution. Importantly, it includes the failure to prevent or respond supportively to wrongdoings within the institution when there's reasonable expectation of protection. And so many of our most important institutions do give the expectation of protection, from law enforcement to colleges to the government. Could we study this? Can we actually measure institution betrayal and its impact? Our first empirical focus was on educational institutions. And starting in around 2010, a new graduate student in my lab, Carly Smith, who's now an assistant professor at Penn State, arrived, and she really wanted to study this empirically. In our first study, we measured 3 things: sexual assault experiences these were undergraduates, trauma symptoms, and institutional betrayal. And to measure institutional betrayal, we had to create a new measurement instrument. It's called the Institutional Betrayal Questionnaire, and it includes behaviors an institution might engage in if there's been a sexual assault. And people could say yes or no if they'd had these experiences in an institution where they'd also had a sexual assault. So it would be, for example, not taking proactive steps to prevent this type of experience, all the way to covering up the experience and even punishing the victim in some way for this experience. When we ran this study with our undergraduates, we saw some things that many researchers have seen: high rates of sexual assault among our undergraduates. And we also saw that many of these sexual assaults did occur in an institutional context, typically in a university, and that to our surprise, that when they occurred in an institutional context, 40% of the time we picked up some amount of institutional betrayal. The maybe most important thing, however, we found is that institutional betrayal is associated with harm. So here we see a graph showing one symptom commonly associated with trauma exposure, or particular sexual assault, which is anxiety symptoms. And the more sexual assault somebody's been exposed to, the more likely they are to be coping with anxiety symptoms. But what you also see in this graph is that when there's institutional betrayal present, that relationship between sexual assault and anxiety is exacerbated. The more sexual assault with institutional betrayal, the steeper that relationship is, which is another way to say that institutional betrayal adds harm over and above the harm of the interpersonal experience. One reason we were not surprised by this finding is that we kept hearing things like, this was back in the early 2010s, but we kept hearing people, especially in the military, talk about, well, I went to join the military and serve my country, and then I got sexually assaulted. But what was even worse was when I tried to report it and get some justice and some help. When you say something's even worse than sexual assault, that would suggest it's pretty bad. And that's consistent with what we've seen now in many, many studies. I'm showing you anxiety, but we see a similar pattern for a host of other trauma-related symptoms. We also see a relationship between physical health and institutional betrayal. So it's associated with physical health problems, even when controlling for betrayal trauma exposure. Some other researchers looked at military sexual assault victims, military sexual trauma survivors, and they asked if those military sexual trauma survivors also experienced institutional betrayal, how were they doing? And they found they were not doing well. Those military sexual trauma survivors with institutional betrayal, compared to the ones without institutional betrayal, had more PTSD symptoms, more depression, and I think most alarmingly, higher odds of attempting suicide. Another way to say that is institutional betrayal can sometimes be a life or death matter for somebody. Our research has picked up some cost to institutions, not just to the individuals. So we see when there's institutional betrayal, more disengagement from the system, illness, absenteeism, turnover, loss of potential workforce. And I would argue that institutional betrayal ultimately contributes to internal rot, corruption, and the eventual collapse of the institution. Will there be a reputational cost? Well, that depends on the society around the institution. Right now, institutions often do suffer a reputational cost when their betrayal is brought fully to light, but that hasn't always been the case. There's also an indication of a kind of institutional betrayal blindness. Remember, betrayal blindness is to let you stay in a kind of abusive situation that you depend upon. So it's not that you want the abuse, but you depend upon somebody or a system, and so you turn a blind eye to the betrayal in order to have those other needs met. And indeed, we find that people who've been exposed to institutional betrayal and stay in the institution are more likely to have dissociative symptoms, that is unawareness and forgetting, even when we control for their interpersonal betrayal trauma exposure. I want to say one final thing about our vulnerability to institutional betrayal, and that this snake is to remind me of a bit of a metaphor. Perhaps I'm a little odd, but I really love boa constrictors, and I've had a number of boa constrictors as pets. And I think, first of all, I think they're beautiful, but I think the other reason I love boa constrictors is that boa constrictors, in my experience, hug. So if I pick up my boa constrictor, it coils around me and it feels like I'm being hugged. And to my little mammal brain, being hugged is a sign of love and caring. Now, intellectually, I don't think that the boa constrictor has those emotions towards me. Boa constrictors are not social. What I think the boa constrictor is doing is getting warm. I'm like this big warm tree. I'm too big to eat, but I am a good source of warmth. And so that hugging is to get warm, but I experience it in emotional, relational terms. That's just because I'm human. And the metaphor here is our relationship to institutions. When institutions do nice things for us, it's totally human to love them. But the important thing to know is that just like that boa constrictor can't love me back, institutions cannot love us back. They are completely incapable of love. They have no nervous system. They have no attachment system. Individuals can love us, but institutions cannot. And it's, I think, an important thing to think about when we give our loyalty to institutions and expect to get love back, because we're not going to get love back. Hopefully we'll be treated well, but we won't be loved. All right, very briefly, I want to introduce you to the concept of DARVO if you are not familiar with it. DARVO is an acronym that I first proposed in the 1990s, and it stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. And it's to capture a kind of perpetrator tactic when you're trying to hold somebody accountable. So the person denies they did it, it never happened, or it happened but it wasn't bad. They attack the credibility of the person making the accusation. You're a liar, you don't have good memory, you're doing this for some other reason. And then most perniciously, they reverse victim and offender. And they say, I'm the real victim here. DARVO was something I observed and to some extent experienced, but one of the most formative observations was the way Anita Hill was treated in the hearings between Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. And I do believe she was quite DARVO'd in those hearings. More recently, Sarah Harsey, who was an undergraduate at the University of Oregon and in my lab and is now a graduate student at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I've done a number of studies to look at DARVO empirically. And the bad news is we have found that it is a pretty effective technique for perpetrators. It's associated with victim self-blame. So that is when victims get DARVO'd, they're more likely to blame themselves. And we know from other research, self-blame is associated with silence. In a more recent study that actually was just published this week, we did 2 experiments, and we found that when people read about a victim perpetrator vignette and there's DARVO present, the people reading this are more likely to doubt the victim's credibility. That is, perpetrator DARVO actually reduces the victim's believability. And that's bad because it means, again, DARPA is an effective strategy. But the good news is that in our second study, we randomly assigned people to be educated about DARPA or not. And the people that were educated were less affected by the DARPA, that is, that didn't discredit the victim's credibility as much. So I'm suggesting now that it be recognized and identified in order to defang it. DARPA can be done in an institutional context, and it often is. It's one of the key ways that institutional betrayal can occur. And an example is when the police charge rape victims with lying. One final note about DARPA. I woke up one morning this year to many emails from friends and colleagues saying that your work was on South Park last night, which was really weird because I'm a psychology professor and my work's not usually on South Park. But indeed, South Park made a 90-second clip that was in the season finale that explained DARPA very, very well. So if you're interested, Google it, DARPA South Park, and you'll find it. It's pretty funny. Okay, final chapter, institutional courage. So can we prevent institutional betrayal? This was a question that was really plaguing me. It seemed that institutional betrayal is just so frequent and so bad. What can we do about it? And I also know it's really tempting to drown in the pain of betrayal or to succumb to betrayal blindness. So either to be paralyzed by how bad things are or to everything's fine. But neither of those responses actually fix anything. In fact, what we need is awareness, hope, and action. And this is where institutional courage comes in. The way we're defining institutional courage right now is an institution's commitment to seek truth and engage in moral action despite unpleasantness and short-term cost. It's a pledge to protect and care for those who are dependent on the institution. And it's a compass oriented to the common good of individuals, institutions, in the world, a force that transforms institutions into more accountable, equitable, healthy places for everyone. I've proposed 10 concrete steps to promote institutional courage. I'm sure there are other steps, but these are a starting point. One is to comply with those laws that are designed to protect people's civil rights, but to not stop with compliance, because that can lead to a checkbox mentality. And related to that, to really be aware of risk management mindsets. Again, can lead to a checkbox mentality that isn't actually courageous at all. Number two, educate the institutional community, especially leadership, about relevant issues, for instance, victim psychology and institutional betrayal. Three is to respond well to victim disclosure. I didn't have time to tell you about it, but we've done research in which we have experimented with teaching people how to respond well, and people are quite educable in terms of learning to become better responders. Four is to bear witness, be accountable, and apologize. And I want to come back to apologies in a minute because they are very powerful. Five is to cherish the truth tellers. So often the people that bring problems to light become the victims of being maligned and darvoed. The truth tellers, though, are actually doing the organization a great favor. And if you think about it, sometimes we recognize this. So in the software industry, people get hired to find bugs, and they get paid for finding bugs. We need a lot more of that, including in the domain of sexual violence and other kinds of victimization. Six is to conduct scientifically sound anonymous surveys. People are not going to come out and tell you many of the things that happen to them. It's too scary and too dangerous, but they will report on scientifically sound anonymous surveys so you can find out what's really going on. Related to that is to regularly engage in self-study, where you ask yourself or your organization about what you might be doing that contributes to institutional betrayal. 8 is to be transparent about data and policy. Sexual violence and corruption thrive in secrecy, and transparency is a great tool to ending those problems. 9 is to use the organization to address the societal problem. And in some cases, this is easier than others, but many organizations have the capacity to go beyond their own boundaries to help the larger problem. So for instance, research universities can research these issues. The entertainment industry could be creating films and shows that rather than objectifying women and portraying violent sexuality, could be presenting institutionally courageous sorts of scenarios. And number 10 is to commit resources to all these steps. None of this is free. None of this is terribly expensive, but none of this is going to be free. I want to tell you, give you an example of what institutional courage can look like, and then tell you about the organization I founded. This example actually comes from Corvallis, Oregon, so not too far from Eugene. And it started in 1998. In 1998, Brenda Tracy was living in Corvallis, and she reported to police she'd been gang raped at a party. 2 of the accused assailants were OSU football players. Prosecutors led her to believe the case was weaker than it was, the rape kits were destroyed, and the 2 football players had 1 game suspension in community service. No one from OSU talked to Brenda Tracy. That was 1998. For the next 16 years, she did the best to live her life, but she suffered. But she, did her best. She got a nursing degree. She raised 2 children. In 2014, there was a lot of talk about campus sexual assault, and Brenda Tracy got the nerve up to call OSU and ask them what had happened with her case. At first, OSU was evasive, but Tracy met John Canzano. Some of you may know he's a sports columnist at the Oregonian, and he wrote a column about the case. And that column presumably was forwarded to OSU President Ed Ray, many copies, and Ed Ray read it. This is where things changed, because unlike what most university presidents do at that moment, which is circle the wagons, Ed Ray ordered an investigation, and three weeks later he met with Brenda Tracy and shared the results of the investigation. Not only that, but he issued an apology letter. Dear Brenda, he wrote, Oregon state officials are very grateful that you took the time to meet with us. We're so sorry for what you experienced in 1998 and have lived with since. What we've learned recently of your suffering is heartbreaking, and your bravery inspires us. We're grateful to you for raising the public dialogue about the consequences of sexual violence in our society, and for raising a discussion of how society can better assist survivors of such violence. While we cannot undo this nightmare, we apologize to you for any failure on Oregon State University's part to better assist you in 1998. That apology sentence, I'm sure, had lawyers, vet it, and it probably wasn't as strong as Ed Ray had originally wanted to say, but it was strong enough, it was sincere enough, saying that you can thread the needle here, and it certainly was perceived by Brenda Tracy as sincere. He went on, as promised a few weeks ago, we conducted an exhaustive review of the facts of how OSU handled this matter 16 years ago. This review was completed this past Friday, and we want to share the results of that review with you. After that, he didn't stop just with an apology. He actually hired Brenda Tracy to be a consultant to address improving the institutional response. And together, many important innovations occurred, and they did really great work. So what does institutional courage look like? This is part of what it looks like. First of all, there was an investigation. They sought truth, and there was transparency. There was an acknowledgement and an apology. There was cherishing the whistleblower by hiring her. And there was reaching beyond the organization by supporting legislation, because they went and actually lobbied Oregon State Legislature. At OSU, they created Sexual Assault Resource Center, and they expanded services on campus. And all this led to a really better environment on campus. And I'm not saying OSU has fixed all the problems, and they haven't. There's ongoing problems. These are big, complicated institutions, but this was such a step in the right direction. So, I take from this and other work we've done that, in fact, while it's going to take a while to end sexual violence, because it's a really deep problem and it's intergenerational, we can end institutional betrayal relatively quickly. And we can do it by nurturing institutional betrayal, and that this will be better for individuals and it better for institutions. And that is really a crucial step in the right direction. I want to mention I've got a lot of resources on my website. I put full text of articles and all those measurement instruments for free on my website. All right, the final thing is this organization that I recently founded. This is really me stepping outside my comfort zone. I have never done anything like this, but I felt that universities weren't stepping up enough on in research on this, and we needed to really create a research center to study institutional courage and an educational center to share the results of that research. So with the help of some remarkable people, I founded the Center for Institutional Courage. And it really all started with an idea that has been germinating for a long time, but really started to take root last academic year when I had a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And a group of us created the Project on Institutional Courage in order to create and basically give birth to the Center for Institutional Courage. Where really the nonprofit took off was on November 15, when I was in Baltimore to give a talk at Johns Hopkins, and my now basically my work wife, who I didn't know at the time, Lisa Schiefelbein, had contacted me and said, you know, I read about your wanting to start this organization. I can help you. I have the skills and I have the time and I have the passion to help you. And I was like, I don't know you, but I'll talk to you. So we met, and the place we happened to meet was this really, really funky diner outside Baltimore International Airport. And these guys were like looking at us while we were dreaming up this organization for a couple of hours. We started sketching it out. We worked intensely every day for months, sort of dreaming up our organization and then asking people to join it. And we were just really blessed with people's cooperation and enthusiasm for the organization. By January, we got some pro bono lawyers who really helped us. We were incorporated. By February, we received our 5013C status. And then we worked really hard to create a website, and I hope you'll go look at it because it really was a major effort to create this website. And I think it's going to be a very powerful tool for us. We have 5 members of our board of directors who are amazing individuals, and lots of other talented people on our team, and all this is from the website. The big picture of this organization, and we call it Courage for short, is that we can transform institutions into more accountable, equitable, healthy places, and that we're going to do it through both research, discovering the keys to institutional courage, and outreach, educating the world. We have some wonderful quotes from remarkable women. One is Gloria Steinem, who gave us a quote for our website that I'm very proud of. She's just such a hero of mine. If you go to the website, you can look at this. And then also Ashley Judd, who's not only gave us a quote, but is serving on on one of our advisory committees. And what I'm really hoping some of you might want to do is join us. We're about to, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, publish our first newsletter. And if you join us, you'd basically be signing up for our newsletter. And the website for that is here. I believe somebody can put it into the chat too if it's not already there, or you can take a picture, a screenshot so that you have it. And that's my last slide. I want to thank you for your attention to all this, and now I really hope to take some questions from you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. So I'll start by rolling through the questions that were in the chat area. Yep. I'm not seeing the chat. I wasn't seeing it at first, so hopefully everyone can see it and use it, but we'll start with those, and then if we have time, we may open up just to let people do verbal questions. So first, someone wanted to know if you will share this slideshow. Along that line also, I am recording this session, so if it's all right with you, Jennifer, we may make this session available as a web link for people to visit if they weren't able to attend live. Is that all right with you?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, and then what about the PowerPoint presentation? Do you want that to be shared, or?
Yeah, I usually share it in the form of a PDF, so I can prepare a PDF and then you're very welcome to circulate it.
Okay, that's great. And I already have, I can convert your PPT that you sent me to PDF. So
Okay.
I will take care of that. Another question was, how can you measure one kind of harm, for example, sexual assault, against another, for example, institutional betrayal, when the same person has suffered from both?
Well, you know, that measurement's a really hard thing in this domain, and it's not a perfect business. But what we do is we create measurement instruments that ask people whether they've experienced certain things, and we describe them very behaviorally. So we don't say, were you sexually assaulted? Because we know that many people who were sexually assaulted will answer that question no. They don't like the label, they don't recognize what happened to them was sexual assault. But if we ask them, were you touched in this particular way without your consent, they may well say yes. And so we have them, like all, you know, basically all the primary researchers in the domain of sexual assault and sexual harassment and so on, we use behavioral measures to find out people's exposure to these sorts of events. Of course, some people don't, you know, were assaulted and don't remember it. And those people, you know, may say no even to the behavioral items. So it's not perfect. But for institutional betrayal, again, we don't ask people, were you betrayed by your institution? But we say, if somebody says they were sexually assaulted or harassed at all, we say, was this in an institutional context? So like say work or school or church. And if they say yes, then we say, did the institution play a role in this particular way? And that's those items from the institutional betrayal questionnaire where we give very, very concrete items. So somebody might say yes to having been even penetrated without their consent. So we know they were, in that case, we know they were raped. And they might say no to institutional betrayal because the institution didn't contribute to the problem. Or other people might say yes to both. So that way we can kind of compare people that have had one thing and not the other, and see, you know, how much each of these sort of bad things contributes to their current suffering right now.
Okay. There's also a couple questions that I'm going to bundle together. The institution's response to your research on institutional betrayal research, can you comment on that in general? And then also on a more timely matter, you know, the police crisis we're having right now, have any police departments reached out to you, or, you know, are you reaching out to them, or, you know, how does that fit in?
Well, I can be so naive, and you'd think I would learn. But I think it's because I have this optimistic side of me or something. But when we first published the results of that, Carly Smith and I first published the results of our study on institutional betrayal. That publication came out in 2013. Even though we'd started that work in 2010, it actually takes a long time to get research published in a peer-reviewed journal. And so it came out in early 2013, and by then there was a lot more attention to campus sexual assault than there had been. And so it caught some media attention, and there was like a little news thing about it. And as soon as there was a news thing about it, I started to hear from colleagues at the University of Oregon specifically about what was going on at the University of Oregon. And I realized all our data was collected at the University of Oregon. So although we hadn't set out to study the University of Oregon, in fact, and to some extent we had, we were just trying to study a general thing and studying it there. But in fact, here we had data about the University of Oregon, both sexual assault rates and institutional betrayal exposure. So here's where my naivete came in, because I'm like, oh, as soon as we tell the administration, they're going to really, really want to fix this. So I called a meeting with the then president, and we had this meeting, and we went to my graduate students who I'd been working with, and we went in and we presented all the data, and we were like, and we're going to fix this, right? And boy, you know, on the surface, they were very polite, but we just started to get the runaround, and no, nothing got fixed. And for the next year, it was like, you know, we weren't getting anywhere. And some other faculty joined me trying to deal with this. And then 2014 rolled around and a couple things happened. One, the Obama administration had created a task force on college sexual assault, and it was getting even more attention. Two, the University of Oregon had an event occur on campus, some of you may remember, involving an alleged gang rape of a student by athletes, and that led to this big crisis on campus. And after the Obama administration created the task force, somewhere in there, they reached out to me and invited me to come to Washington and talk to them. And so, so all these things were happening at once, and I started to get some traction. And it's hard to say, was it the White House attention? Was it the gang rape? I don't know. I started to get some traction finally with the university to do something about things. But then suddenly, again, I'm at a stone wall when I actually tried to do a survey on campus, and they were going to support it, and then they said not, and it got pretty ugly for a while. We went ahead and did it anyway. What I learned from all this, and this is why I came up with the word courage, because at that point, until that, I didn't really have that concept courage. The reason I came up with the concept courage is I realized there is enormous resistance to change. And it's like, duh, I should have predicted that. Because the institutional betrayal is keeping the system, is maintaining the status quo. And so I'm trying to disrupt the status quo. So of course there's resistance to change, and therefore it takes courage to overcome that. And it can get pretty ugly and pretty hard. And what I try to do just for my own well-being is put on my researcher hat and go, okay, this is interesting. What am I going to learn from this? Because of course it hurts, but it's also, it is grist for the mill. I do learn from it. And have any police departments reached out to me? Absolutely not. Where I've been getting some communications in the last couple of weeks is from primarily Black activists who see the relevance, especially with Darvo and institutional betrayal. And, you know, there have been some prominent Black activists who've made, you know, connected the dots, but nobody on the institution side really has reached out to me. But, you know, I keep trying, and I do sometimes find institutions are responsive. There probably is always some resistance, but it's a matter of degree too. And some institutions, maybe because of their leadership or other cultural factors within the institution, are, you know, wanting to change and do better. So maybe out there is a, you know, there are police departments or maybe city governments or whatever that would want to use this work to become better.
Okay. One person asked, and Pat, if you need to explain this question more, you can unmute yourself, but she asked, is that Shelley Carell from Stanford?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, Shelley is one of our outreach advisors, and she's a very important person to me. I'm a great Shelley Carell fan. Sounds like somebody else is too.
Great. And then you know, there's the whole angle of your own lawsuit that is, of course, being supported by AAUW's National Legal Advocacy Fund. I don't know how much you can comment on that at this point, but this group, of course, is particularly interested in any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah. Well, of course, my lawyers are always nervous about what I'm saying. But you know, it might be easier to answer a specific question than just a general thing. But I do want to, you know, just for people who you know haven't been following it really closely, point out that right now what we're waiting for is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to rule on our appeal, and our appeal is that the district court judge in Oregon had granted the university's motion for a summary judgment, which is to say the university said, we don't think that this case should go to trial because the plaintiffs, you know, the plaintiffs can't possibly win. And we don't agree with that at all. We want our jury trial. And so we said to the Court of Appeals, no, we disagree. We want our day in court. So if the Court of Appeals rules in our favor, and everything's a long shot, but if they rule in our favor, all that does is get us back to where we would have been, like more than a year ago, of just trying to get a trial. So we still would have to do all that work going to trial, and we're really grateful for the AAUW support, because if we do win the appeal, then we're going to get some support as we go forward into that trial. I'm willing to entertain other questions on this if there's specific questions. I might not be able to answer, but I don't mind being asked.
Okay. Nobody has posted any more questions in the chat. If there's anyone that would feel far more comfortable posing their question verbally, go ahead and unmute yourself and give it a try, and hopefully we won't have everyone doing it at once. Okay, so I think that means that we're good to go. So Jennifer, thanks so much. And of course, keep in touch with us over time. Obviously what you're working on is a marathon, not a sprint. And we're here for you for the marathon. So
yeah, I hope some people join up on the website. We'd love that. Okay, thank you all.
All right.
For your courage.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
For presenting.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you. Bye.
Carol?